Tony Long is a former Metropolitan Police Specialist Firearms Officer. He wrote a book called Lethal Force, and he has used lethal force on his job as an armed British policeman, and he joins me now. Hi, Tony.
Good morning. How you doing?
So you clarified when I was introducing you wrongly the first time that there is a difference between a Met Firearms and a Met Specialist Firearms Officer?
Yes. Yeah, it's basically, I suppose an SFO in North American terms would be what you would call SWAT. But in my opinion, having done SWAT training in the States, they are trained to a probably much higher standard than most. Their initial selection course is 21 weeks, for instance, to do that, to be a basic specialist firearms officer.
Well, specialist firearms officers by the dozens have refused to report for work this week with their weapons. Can you tell me what has happened and why now?
Well, it's not just SFOs or specialist firearms officers. It's also armed response vehicles, which are the sort of next level down, who provide the 24-hour mobile response to any 999 call involving firearms or knives. And there's also a large amount of other AFOs, or authorised firearms officers, who visitors to London will see standing outside the Palace or Westminster armed, or 10 Downing Street, or any of the other key locations. And we also have other officers who are trained in the use of firearms, for instance, specialist surveillance officers who work on cases involving heavily armed criminals. And sections of all of those different grades of firearms officers have surrendered their firearms ticket or their license to carry a firearm. And what's actually been the straw that has broken the camel's back in relation to this is the appearance in court of an officer who's got at the moment an anonymity code of NX121. Now, what police firearms officers do have is an anonymity code, and if they get involved in a shooting, when they write their statement, they write it using that anonymity code, as do all of their colleagues. And so when all the paperwork is being processed and being investigated, no one other than the individual officers and their unit commander know their true identity. Now, that is an internal thing that we do, and normally it's honoured at court. So when I appeared at court in 2015 at the Central Criminal Court charged with murder, for instance, as soon as I was charged with murder, I lost my anonymity code, and then the public, via the press, knew that I was Anthony Long, former firearms officer. All of my colleagues who were still serving were allowed to give their evidence using their anonymity code, so Echo 1, Echo 2, Echo 3, etc. So this is something it's always been reliant on the courts. Some courts will look at it and go, no, we don't recognise the anonymity code. You are all going to have to give your evidence in person using your real name. So it's something that it's an internal procedure, but it's normally honoured by the courts unless you are charged with murder. Well, NX121 was involved in a situation that we can't talk about in British law because it's now what we call sub judice, which means he has been charged and it cannot be discussed publicly until such time as the evidence is heard in court. There is a hearing, an anonymity hearing, this Thursday coming at the Old Bailey, where the officer will have to appear. And there's a very high probability that the judge at the Central Criminal Court will withdraw that anonymity. And from that point on, the world will know his name. Well, in the United Kingdom, to be a firearms officer is a completely voluntary thing. So, for instance, in the Metropolitan Police, which is the largest force in the country, which covers London, there's something...
I wanted just to backtrack with you there, because a lot of people don't understand that British police are not armed, but they all armed. They are armed, and it gets confusing. The average...
I'm trying to clarify.
Yeah, the average beat policeman... policewoman doesn't carry a firearm. They might have a taser, but there are armed response units for the case of, let's say, as you mentioned, VIP security or protecting embassies, or let's say there's a terrorist incident, then there are guns on the street, and those armed response officers attend. They are called within minutes. They're supposed to have zones that they patrol, and furthermore, just coming to your point, that's voluntary. They do not as part of their job, have to carry weapons, they volunteer to be in those units, correct?
That is absolutely correct. So, as for instance, out of the Metropolitan Police, there are roughly sort of 40,000 police officers. Only 2,500 of those officers are trained in the use of firearms. It's a very difficult course to pass, even at basic level. It's a very expensive course.
Yeah.
So by the time someone gets to the top of the tree and becomes a counter-terrorist specialist firearms officer, you're talking, over a year of training in order to get into that role.
Okay, so Thursday he will appear in court if he is identified by the court by name at that point.
Yeah.
Why is that viewed as negative by other police officers, and what may happen?
Well, it's viewed as being a negative thing by all police officers, I would say, even those that don't carry a firearm. But because it's such a unique role in the United Kingdom, and because these officers are employed on counter-terrorist operations, they really don't want their photographs taken or their name released publicly. That's the issue, because there has been incidents in the past where people's home address has been compromised and they've had to move out. It's a different world elsewhere in the world where every single police officer carries a firearm. And so as I said earlier, NX 121 is really the sort of straw that's broken the camel's back, really, because there's been a whole range of issues in relation not just to anonymity, but the way that armed police officers are treated after they get involved in shootings. So I don't know what the situation is in Canada or the United States. I know it is different, but I mean, for instance, it took 10 years between my shooting and me appearing in court. There are serving officers now still waiting 3-5 years after they've been involved in a shooting to just simply to go back to work.
So you mentioned that you were charged with murder, which I wanted to come to, in the shooting, as I understand it from your book, which I read some time ago, that this was a gang, a person or organized criminal who was on his way potentially to carry out the shooting of somebody else. That's how you were briefed.
We were briefed that a group of criminals from an organised crime group, as it turned out, there was 3 of them, would be going to a location in North London where they were going to rob and kill rival Colombian drug dealers who they dealt with in the past. So clearly, the fact that they bought drugs off these Colombians in the past, they weren't going to just turn up with guns and steal the drugs, because the Colombians knew who they were. So
okay, you were charged with murder, and it's an incredible story that people have to read your book to get a full accounting of, and we just don't have time to go through all of that case now. But can you tell me, policemen are human beings, just like anybody else. To have that, you were acquitted, first of all, is what we should have said. To have that hanging over your head for 10 years? Are you serious?
Well, I mean, it was complicated. And as you said, read the book, because then you'll find out why it was so complicated. It was all around legality. But one of the issues that I would make is that NX 121 appeared in court last week and was taken to the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court, because a magistrate, a sort of lower level judge, can't issue bail for murder. That has to be done by a senior judge at a senior court. And exactly the same process happened to me. And I remember sitting in the witness box and the judge asking a group of about 10 journalists who were sitting at the back of the court what their opinion was on whether or not I should get anonymity. And they weren't represented in court. So he allowed one of them to stand up as a spokesperson and explain why it was that they collectively, from different newspapers, different TV programs, didn't agree with me getting anonymity. And I just sat there with my mouth open and thinking, well, what's going on here? And it just shows really that the freedom in the press in the United Kingdom is considered, right up there,
well, your press are certainly famous, but
yeah,
but the idea that a magistrate would turn to journalists in the courtroom and ask them their opinion on whether an officer should be identified or not
well, this time around, this Thursday, undoubtedly, that the press, I know that the press have got their act together, and they have all collectively got a single barrister or senior lawyer to argue their case. And they will argue that it infringes their right, the freedom of the press. Well, you know, I understand that. We all rely on the press, but that the press over the years, I've been involved in quite a few shooting incidents, have simply made stuff up about me. I mean, even the day I was acquitted, one of the main British newspapers referred to me as Anthony Long, police constable, and the specialist firearms team, known as his colleagues as the executor. Well, completely made up, completely and utterly made up, as were half a dozen others.
I know in Canada, I mean, returning to the law, in Canada, if a policeman is charged with murder, he would certainly be identified. But I take your point that these are counterterrorism operations as well. So a member of MI6 or Canadian intelligence or the CIA or FBI, or they would receive different treatment.
That's a very good point. I hadn't really thought about that, but yeah, I would put that in the same. In the UK, because of the fact that they're all volunteers, and many of them are heavily involved in counterterrorism work, and also work against organised crime groups, I would definitely equate that.
Absolutely. And who would want to serve in a unit dealing with counterterrorism or dealing with organized criminals if you are going to be identified and potentially your address given out? And I can understand why the officers are angry about that, but it goes beyond identification now.
No, absolutely. It does,
because
absolutely.
Police feel that this guy is being sold down the river and should not be charged with murder, where Chris Kaba, a 24-year-old man, is shot dead following a police chase a year ago. So we come back to the timing of this charge again. He refused reportedly to stop. A coroner's inquest heard some of that evidence. So they will say that he wasn't armed. But can I ask you, as a policeman, a former policeman, if a car is coming at you, is the car not considered to be a weapon? And if that weapon is, if you're standing in front of it, it seems to me that, and you're identified and you're in your uniform, it certainly would not be a murder charge. In many jurisdictions, most policemen would never face that charge.
So more police officers are being killed by vehicles driven at them ever in the UK than being shot at. And that we have more fatalities on our roads every year than we do criminal shootings or stabbings. So yes, absolutely, a car would be treated as a lethal weapon. And certainly police firearms officers are trained. And this is the issue, is that an awful lot of stuff has been put before the courts, and courts have come back with what we would call perverse decisions, which has rendered things that have been taught to police officers. Yes, if you do this, you'll be looked after by the law. And one of those things is honestly held belief. In British law, if you, let's say, for instance, shot somebody because you feared that your life was in immediate danger, or your colleagues or other people's lives were in immediate danger, then provided, and you thought they had a gun, but it turned out that they didn't have a gun, then if you shot them working on the premise that you had an honestly held belief that he did have a gun, or that the gun was real, or that he was a suicide bomber, in the case of John Charles de Menezes, for instance, in 2005, then the courts would look after you. What's happened is the Independent Office of Police Complaints, if that's what they're called this week, I've lost track of them, but they're the independent body that investigate police after incidents such as shootings, have taken this honestly held belief to higher courts. And it's now been decided by the courts that that level of force, if you use that level of force, certainly from a civil standpoint, you're not entitled to that honestly held belief. It's very complicated, and I'm not sure.
No, it's not so complicated. And it's really important here, because in your case, you were briefed that there was going to be a shooting. These guys were on their way to carry out a killing. And
we were told specifically what type of weaponry they had as well. Which
there were wiretaps and other evidence that you could not use for your own defense, which I found bizarre. But you are briefed as an armed officer. This is what you're going to deal with. In this case of Chris Kaba, it has already come out that that vehicle was linked to a shooting the day before. this is not a routine traffic stop like some of these incidents in America.
So, but if you were to read the press, he would be described by the press as being an unarmed young black man shot dead by police. Azelle Rodney, the guy that I shot, was in a car. They had balaclavas in their pockets. They had gloves in their pockets. They had plastic cable ties to handcuff up their victims, and they had 3 guns. Now, the guns weren't the specific type that were described to us because they were talking in patois on the phone. So it was an interpretation, but we absolutely believed they were armed, and they were armed. However, when I approached the vehicle, Azelle Rodney was sitting in the back seat, and he ducked down and he came up, and his body language told me 100% he's armed himself. He's picked a gun up off the vehicle floor or whatever, and he's armed. And it transpired he was. The gun was found down underneath his body. But my evidence was that I didn't see a gun, which I didn't. Now, had it been in the 1970s or 80s, I would have probably just gone, you know what, I saw a gun. But I didn't. Yeah, I knew the incident was videoed, so I told the court exactly what I saw. Azelle Rodney, to this day, and obviously it's all coming up again now because of this current thing, is still described by the press as an unarmed black man, even though it's gone through the courts and it's been proved beyond doubt that he did have guns in the vehicle. The press are still describing in that way, and that's one of the problems with the Cabot incident. Is whatever actually happened, and as I said, I feel uncomfortable about talking about it, and so I won't. But whatever was the true story has been suppressed and has been boiled down to police have shot an unarmed black man because it fits the narrative that causes sensationalism. And unfortunately,
well, I mean, I'm not sure I would blame the press here. I know you and I would probably differ on these on this kind of stuff, but a lot of the information is released by the Met, and it's released by his commanding officers, and it's released by the independent investigation, supposedly independent investigation. So that, I mean, the press has led down the trail on some of this stuff, but certainly,
it may well be. But for instance, I know of only one newspaper that reported a key fact. Because from an eyewitness, and that information only appeared in one newspaper. So,
is there a better way, rather than a policeman who? And I am not defending this policeman. Like I have no stake in one way or the other in this, but it strikes me as quite bizarre coming from the North American system that he is charged with murder at this point. Is there not another system? Yeah, where you have people demonstrating in the street, angry that an unarmed black man was killed, as the newspapers reported it. Is there not another forum other than a murder charge, which potentially destroys that officer's life and makes other officers unwilling to serve, where the public gets to hear the real evidence, and there's a forum for fact, rather than rumor and what the angry relatives say?
I think there is, and I'd make 2 points. The first is, I think, and this has been discussed, and as you're probably aware, the commissioner has gone to the Home Secretary with a list of things that firearms officers think would make things more open, but at the same time would brief the public and would benefit them as because they're just seen as the bad guys, as are cops generally at the moment. We're going through a particularly bad patch. But the first thing is,
and that's relevant, by the way.
Yeah, but first is exactly. So first is following sort of the American style system that we see on YouTube and on social media all day long, which is where the chief of police stands up in front of the press and gives a brief, including body-worn video footage of what actually happened. Not cutting out obviously at the gory details, but basically so that everybody knows, right? Yeah, this guy was doing this, and this is why the police ended up having to interact with him. And this is what he did when they interacted with him, and this is why he ended up shot or tasered or punched in the face or whatever it might be. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, as I said earlier, these men and women that volunteer to carry firearms are just that. They're volunteers. And like you, I suspect, I think it's totally wrong that when they do what they're trained to do with an honestly held belief, the only course of action that the IOPC and the British legal system seems to have available to it is to charge them with a criminal offence. Now, if you were to look at other bodies, so for instance, the bodies that oversee doctors' licensing, paramedics' licensing, nurses' licensing, that isn't the first course of action if one of those people accidentally kills someone. If in perfectly good faith, in the pouring rain, on a dark night with bad lighting, a paramedic accidentally gives the wrong type of adrenaline to somebody having a heart attack, then they could kill them. And you could say that they were negligent. But if they did it for the right reasons, it wouldn't be held to be criminal. Same with a surgeon. If a surgeon, carried out a procedure and it turned out that procedure was the wrong procedure for the problem and the person died, the first course of action would be for any of these people, for their governing bodies, to look at it and go, right, okay, you need retraining. You need for the next 2 years to only be able to work or as a surgeon while mentored by another experienced surgeon. Or it might just come down to words of advice or whatever, but that would be the course of action rather than go to criminality. There's two famous cases in the UK that I'm sure you're aware of. One was a doctor called Harold Shipman, who was just on an industrial scale killing his elderly patients. This was about 10, 15, 20 years ago. Now that's murder. That's murder. That's not he accidentally gave them the wrong drugs. That's murder. And more recently, literally within the last couple of weeks, a nurse has been convicted of murdering babies, on an industrial scale, giving them dangerous drugs. And they found out because, it's just so happens this particular nurse is on duty when all of these murders take place. And she has been convicted of that. That is murder. If you go out to catch an armed criminal, 99% of the time, that armed criminal will surrender, or he'll throw away his gun and run, and you'll catch him and you'll taser him, or you'll, grab him and throw him to the ground. So it's a very rare occasion. And normally, on average, out of thousands and thousands, something like in excess of 8,000 armed deployments a year, they'll in the whole of the UK, this is 42 police forces, they'll kill on average kill about 2 suspects. That's 0.05% of the operations they're involved in. It's extremely rare. And that, of course, is one of the problems. It's such a rarity that when it happens in the UK, we get a press frenzy, and people who don't live in a firearms society, who don't understand why police officers might have to resort to the use of firearms, object. And that's really fundamentally why these volunteers are in the position that they're in.
The mood in the United Kingdom, especially with the Met, is quite exceptional right now, because there was a report that came out, said they were institutionally racist, institutionally misogynist. There was the murder by a Met armed officer of a young lady during the pandemic. The mood and anger towards the police right now, which if people don't live here should know, it is seething. So do you think that sets the backdrop for what would be an unfair charge potentially against a policeman who was doing his duty? And can this guy even get a fair trial?
Well, I'll talk about the last point you made first, is that, yes, I strongly suspect, as is with the case with Azelle Rodney, that because he was a young black man, and because Chris Cabell was a young black man, that the Crown Prosecution Service, which is sort of our equivalent of the American DA's office, I guess, will make a decision about whether to charge. I think they are influenced by it. I know for a fact that Crown Prosecution Service officers or lawyers in my case did everything they could to swerve becoming involved in the Azelle Rodney case, because they saw it as political. They saw it as the fact that, in my terms, I was given a shit sandwich and I had to take a bite of it, and they didn't really want anything to do with it. So that's the first thing. So yes, there is a thing, and there's a connectivity with the international thing here. The Paris are getting exactly the same. Paris police are getting exactly the same criticism, although they are far, far more robust in their dealings with minority groups and the like than the UK police is. I think the UK police is totally different to the rest of the world. But most of this revolves around the George Floyd shooting. It's got progressively worse because of that. But the other thing is,
I mean, I'm all, you and I may also walk a different path here in terms of scrutiny. I mean, I'm all for serious scrutiny for
absolutely.
an incident that takes somebody's life one way or the other.
Absolutely.
And the same for policemen. I mean, policemen are in the line of fire. They deserve our protection. But if this isn't handled, if Crown prosecutions become politically sensitive to the point that they just lay a murder charge because they want to quiet the street, in essence, they want to stop the demonstrations. How many officers are ever going to become armed officers in the UK?
Well, so normally there's 300 or 400 applicants for the armed response vehicles when they put out for applicants every year. This year there were 50. Out of those 50, probably about 50% will not get through the training. So you're probably going to end up with, 20, 25 officers. And, as we know now, I don't know if you're aware of this, but I woke up to a text message to say that Sky were contacted anonymously by a serving police officer last night to say that if he loses his anonymity, there will be a mass handing in of blue cards. Because I don't know if you're also aware that I believe yesterday that some of the officers had returned based on the promises made by the commissioner that they would try and sort some of these issues that the police firearms officers have. Yes, I think it is political.
I think for me, this case is less about the policeman's identity. I understand it's so important to policemen, that anonymity, but it's more about the laying of the most serious charge in the criminal code, as far as I can think of, a murder charge, which will change this man's life forever, when he may well be acting in the public's best interest on the street, and whether that harsh procedure is warranted. And I guess we'll only know by following the court case and understanding what comes out later. But the concern by other officers who no longer want to carry weapons now, you can certainly understand why many of them feel that way. Tony Long, author of Lethal Force. It's a book that came out several years ago, but it kind of brings you to a lot of what we're talking about right now. So it's a good background.
There's a historical link through all of this.
Yeah, Tony, thank you so much.
Thank you.